Good morning, Pastor Ron Jetter, Immanuel Lutheran Church. It is Wednesday, the 7th of October, 2020. As you knew, last week we were traveling. We had gone down to Northern California to see our daughter, came up through Oregon to see our son and the grandkids, traveling on Interstate 5, just north of the California border in Oregon, between Ashland and Medford. There was tremendous devastation from fires, homes gone, chimneys fallen over from the heat, but all that remained except for the ash, the blackened earth, trees and stumps of trees, dried trees ready to burn again, a mobile home park that was simply gone. The heat so intense that even the metal had melted into the ash, indistinguishable from the rest of the rubble. One of the things I noticed too as we traveled along, every so often there will be a highway named after a fallen highway patrolman. That's true in our state, it's true in Oregon, it's true in California, probably true in every state, that those who die in the line of duty are often memorialized with a section of highway dedicated to them. And I thought, what about all the firefighters, the first responders who are out there putting their lives on the line, some who have lost their lives? How do we honor them? How do we memorialize firefighters? We remember the 10-mile fire years ago when 4 young people out of Yakima County died and were memorialized with 4 columns of basalt up near the fire center. I think it's in Natchez. One of the things we looked for today in chapter 50, the final chapter of the book of Genesis, is how to memorialize someone who has been an institution, someone whose name started out as one thing, but whose name then became synonymous with a people and a religion. He was Jacob. He became Israel, the one who has striven with God and survived. Israel has died. Chapter 50, verse 1. Joseph threw himself on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. Joseph commanded the physicians in his service to embalm his father. So the physicians embalmed Israel. They spent 40 days in doing this, for that is the time required for embalming, and the Egyptians wept for him for 70 days. So we have a couple of details there. One, the practice of embalming. Now, today, Orthodox Jews cannot be embalmed. They must be buried within 24 hours of death, barring, of course, some kind of coroner's inquest, some legal reason not to. But in no case should they be embalmed. That rather the body should be given back to the earth. In the time of Jesus, we know what the practice was. The body was not so much embalmed as anointed with balm, with usually the reduced juices of roots or flowers, so that it was very floral to cover up the smell of death and decay, and then wrapped in cloth, cotton or linen, and then placed in a tomb, usually dug out of the side of a hill in that soft soapstone or sandstone of the Middle East. That's their typical practice then. And then after a year, when the body had decayed and there's only bones left, those bones would be then taken and collected together, and if necessary then broken into smaller pieces so they would fit in a clay jar known as an ossuary. And that ossuary could then be reburied or put into a place with the family burial area. It could be in a smaller cave so that there could be many ossuaries in there. And we know this from archaeology too. They've found a number of caves where they've had ossuaries. Sometimes these pots have contained fragments of scripture, such as the Qumran discovery in the 1950s that had scrolls of the book of Isaiah, pieces of Isaiah in these pots, along with bones in these ossuary pots. But here, this is now some 1650 years before the birth of Jesus, we have embalming. And I have to say, I side with the Orthodox Jews. The idea of being embalmed doesn't really thrill me. The idea of having chemical preservatives keeping my physical body from going back to the earth doesn't really appeal to me whatsoever. Even being placed in a box and buried seems to me a waste of resources. I'd rather be cremated and the ashes scattered, as was the case with my parents. My mother-in-law, oh no, we're going to do the whole thing. I want to look nice. I want to be dressed nice. I want to be in a box. I want to be in a place that you can go visit. I want a nice stone on it. I want the embalming, so I will look nice for a long time, even though no one will see me. To each their own. The other thing we learned from this one paragraph is this other detail. 40 days. It took 40 days to do the embalming. So a very slow process. And we do know some of the kinds of things that they did there. They didn't have the modern embalming chemical. They didn't have what we call formaldehyde. And they would use mostly herbal kinds of ointments and extracts of plants. That's what they had available at the time. Then 70 days was the time of weeping or of mourning, it says, in Egypt. It was only then, after 70 days, that they could then take the body of Jacob, Israel, back to the land of Canaan. And now this is an interesting detail. He had said he wanted to be buried back there with his parents, with Abraham and Sarah, with Isaac and Rebekah, and next to his wife Rachel, his beloved wife, as well as the others. Pharaoh gave him permission, go bury your father. So all the kids were left, but Joseph and his brothers and some of the others in their household, probably the wives, left, took chariots, took wagons, and made that 300-mile journey back from Egypt up to the land of Canaan, to modern-day Israel. But here's a curious detail then. Verse 7, Joseph went to bury his father. With him went all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of the household, as well as the household of Joseph, both chariots and charioteers. When they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond the Jordan, they held there a great and sorrowful lamentation. He observed a time of mourning for his father 7 days. Atad, beyond the Jordan. So they went clear into Israel and then crossed over the Jordan River into the land that had not been promised to them, where there are other tribes living there, other Canaanite tribes. So it's as though they have to reenact the crossing of the Jordan River. Remember, Abraham came across the Jordan River to the land that God promised him, the land of Canaan. He told his son, go back across that land when it was time to get a wife. And then Isaac came back across the Jordan. Jacob, the same thing, time to get a wife, and got 2 wives and 2 maids, and came back across the Jordan. Now Joseph takes Jacob/Israel's bones across the Jordan, and then finally back into the land of Canaan, back to this place that they call Mamre, near the Oaks of Mamre, where the burial is of the entire family of the patriarchs of Israel, the nation. Why this crossing over? Is that a symbolic, spiritual crossing over too? We'll find out later, 1,600 years later, 1,300 years later, about the Greeks and their belief that there's this river that you must cross over. The river Styx, or in Roman, the crossing of the Rubicon, where you go from one reality to another. Interesting thing. But then they finally buried their dad. The chapter ends then with the brothers saying to themselves, uh-oh, Dad's gone. And there's this verse then, 15. What if Joseph still bears a grudge against us and decides it's payback time now? So they went to Joseph, and this was our Old Testament lesson just 4 weeks ago. Went to him and says, Joseph, Dad said you're supposed to forgive us. And Joseph goes, God, forgotten. God meant this to happen for good, to preserve us. You guys, you don't have to make up lies and excuses. We're family here. And then finally, Joseph gives his last will and testament, saying, when I die, I want my descendants to make sure that my bones are buried back in the land of Canaan. I have become an Egyptian in order to preserve the legacy of my father, to preserve the people Israel, who will be in Egypt for a while. He has no idea how long, but it says he's 110 years old when he dies. So he's been there for many, many years. And it says he has great-grandchildren there, that his son Ephraim and Manasseh have had 3 generations. So he's seen the generations come, and it's growing there, the people Israel in the land of Goshen. And he says, when you do go back, because he knows they have to go back to the land God gave him. When you do go back, take my bones with you. Bible study, 4 p.m. today. Tomorrow, we begin the rest of the story. Genesis is the backstory for what happens next.